This is a festival that all of us work really hard to keep free and available for all. I think it's maybe the only thing that is free on this island. So we really want to thank all of you, and we most especially want to thank our top donors, Richie Battle, Randy and Lisa Cohn, Ellen and Linwood Dame, Elizabeth Galvin, Adam and Ramona Nee, Nancy Seaman and Alan Schwartz, Beth Wilkinson and David Gregory, and our top sponsors, the White Elephant and the Boston Globe. So again, we're just grateful for everyone who's here. Julian Brave NoiseCat, who is sitting right beside me, is a writer, an Oscar-nominated documentary filmmaker, a champion powwow dancer, and a proud member of his ancestral clan. His journalism has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the New Yorker, who named his book, We Survived the Night, one of 2025's best books. He was named one of Time 100's emerging leaders. And today, we welcome Julian to the stage. Welcome, Julian. So Julian, you have carried your stories into the world. The story of your family, your people, the much larger canvas of the exploration of reclamation and survival amidst generational trauma, and a history that did its best to erase Indigenous life. This is an enormous work of scholarship and personal archaeology. How did you come to know you had a book in you?
Well, firstly, Mary, thank you so much for having me here at the Nantucket Book Festival. It's a real honor to be included among so many esteemed authors. I was texting with my friend David Wallace Wells, who I think spends some of his summers here on the island, and he was telling me also about the incredible history, the literary history, intellectual history of Nantucket, which I, other than Moby Dick, did not really know. You know, for example, I did not know that Frederick Douglass gave his first big major speech here in Nantucket. It's not exactly what I associated with Nantucket as a West Coast person, but it's a real honor to be included as part of this festival. You know, I think that part of what is challenging about being a native storyteller is that so often our story is one of loss and death. And to a certain extent, that was actually true of my first major project that was out in the world, that was sugarcane. I directed a documentary alongside Emily Cassie about the investigation at the Indian residential school that my family was sent to near Williams Lake, British Columbia. If you haven't seen it, it's available on Disney Plus and Hulu. And you know, that documentary had a kind of a dream run for documentary films. It was honored with over 50 international recognition prizes, different sorts of things, and was nominated for an Academy Award, which was really crazy. But you know, from the perspective of someone who tells stories, and not just about the residential school, about my people and our current existence here in North America and beyond, it was a bit troubling to look back at the big picture and sort of see that the last moment that Native people were relevant in the news, were relevant to the world, was at a moment in time when they were discovering hundreds and then thousands of potential unmarked graves of children at these schools that our people were sent to be assimilated. In a certain sense, it kind of reinforced this idea that our people only really matter to the rest of the world when we're dead or dying. And so, what I have always kind of set out to do in my journalism and now with my book is to tell the story of a people who are living, who are a very vibrant, despite the way that our story is often told, very cosmopolitan community, and to help reclaim some of our power, and I think also the beauty in our life and narrative. Contrary to the way that indigenous peoples are often portrayed in American culture, which is, it's worth pausing for just a second and also saying that portrayals of indigenous peoples are central to the creation of American culture. If we're talking about Hollywood, for example, where would Hollywood be without the Western? This really was part of the basis of, building the cultural factory of the free world, was portraying Native people in this way as the opposition, as the savage, as the dying people. Contrary to that immense, body of portrayal, there is this world of my people out there who are reclaiming our languages and our cultures, who are often taking back our land, who are punching far above our weight in politics, in the arts. And that was, in a sense, a world that I knew from growing up. I happened to grow up, the son of a Native artist, and was exposed to that world from a young age. But it was also one that I myself had been, to a certain extent, alienated from, because I actually am the child of two worlds. My mother is an Irish-Jewish New Yorker. I don't know if you can tell by looking at me, but I actually have my aunt in one of the pews over here, and my cousin. And my dad is obviously not that. He's a Secwepemc artist, and he left when I was a young boy. And so to a certain extent, also telling these stories was my way of trying to understand him and trying to understand this big, beautiful, complicated Native world that he was a part of.
You really do, like you weave. So it is, and everyone who reads this book will absolutely feel, and that is, neuroscience is showing us that actually what we understand as readers is so true. We feel, when we understand and enter a story, we feel the characters, we feel the life, and you paint a very vivid picture of a very dynamic people and generationally growing. And in fact, here we are with baby Copper and Joan and generations that are continuing. But you do weave a very intricate web of family, of this extensive clan of grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, and your mother and father, whose father, your own story packs, the father's story packs the punch of beginnings. Tell us how your father's story began.
So my father's story beginnings are complicated, of course, but my father's story begins, he was born in 1959 on August 16th at an Indian residential school outside Williams Lake called St. Joseph's Mission. And he was found moments later in the school's trash incinerator by the night watchman. I did not know this story. My father did not know this story until I set out to write this book and to direct the documentary Sugarcane about that investigation at St. Joseph's Mission.
Because he heard the sounds, he thought it was a cat.
Yeah.
He heard the sounds coming from the incinerator, and this little life was saved.
Yeah, and what's crazy about that piece of the story, the night watchman described my father's cries for life, as you said, as the noise of a cat, which is a quote that we found in the Williams Lake Tribune, which is the local small-town conservative newspaper. What's crazy about that is that our last name is, of course, NoiseCat. And to make the story even a little bit more, we're in a church today, and part of what is kind of wild about the story is that our last name does not actually have anything to do with noises or cats. It was written down wrong by the missionaries. Traditionally, the name would have been said NoiseCat, and then it became NoiseCat by being incorrectly, transliterated by the missionaries. And then, it came to have this sort of new story and new meaning through the story of my father's survival. So, there's something in there, I guess, about meaning, about Indians and names.
Well, that story of his survival, because the cries of this baby bringing to light the horrors of these Catholic institutions that would take these children from their families and put them in these institutions. It's beyond cruelty. And of course, as Julian mentioned earlier, in the end, they have found graves, so many graves of children that were buried quietly and disappeared. They systematically and systemically altered families, the culture, the generational knowledge of Indigenous people. But you entered that darkness to bring to light through scrutiny, through examination, your book and your documentary. And that's what I think, and again, you start this way, but you're bringing to light a new way of looking at a family history and looking at Indigenous history. So talk about how you managed to understand, here's a book. I have a book in me, I have a film. How did you decide you were going to tell that story?
There's a lot of ways to answer that question. I'll answer it in perhaps the most unexpected way. So most people don't look at me and see an Irish Catholic kid. But 3 out of 8 of my great-grandparents were Irish, and my grandfather was actually a writer. His name was Joe Roddy. He was the lead writer for Look magazine before it went belly up, and he was a pretty damn good writer too. His story is about as Irish Catholic as they come in a certain sense. He went to seminary and then became a writer, which is, I don't know, that's a pretty Irish story in my opinion. And he wrote a lot about the church. He also was really big into arts and cultural and music writing. So he actually, if you ever want to go look it up, he wrote an incredible profile of his friend, Glenn Gould, for the Canadian pianist, I should add, for the New Yorker in 1960. It's called The Apollonian. So in a certain way, I actually inherited the writing thing through my mother. So my mom, not a writer, but always encouraged me to write. She, to this day, is usually my first reader and my first editor. And so the craft of writing itself, actually, I would say, comes from that side of my family. I also have an uncle who was a journalist for Reuters through his career. And then, I would also add that, one of the things that is often overlooked and that kind of, frustrates me about the lack of attention paid to Native people and to Native stories is that if you hang out in any res living room across the continent, you're going to run into some of the most wonderful, complex, hilarious stories that you've ever heard in your life, and some of the best storytellers. I have, on my father's side, I have an uncle who, late nights dying, they should give this guy a late night show. I think that he would be pretty damn good at it. And, in a sense...
There's a little hole in late night right now.
Yeah. And, in a sense, part of the other tradition that I think I'm trying to honor is, a tradition that has, since, the beginning of time, been very adept at the art of telling stories. It was not that long ago, culturally and literally in terms of time, that on my father's side of our family, we were spending the winter in a pit house in Western Canada. Pit house is a subterranean winter home that our people would spend the winters in. And, of course, there was no TV, no radio, no devices. And so, what do you think people got good at doing? We got really good at telling stories. We got really good at, BSing. And to this day, if you spend time with, my family on that side, the extent to which they value wordplay, wittiness, there could be a native Seinfeld. It's just that, our culture just doesn't choose to look to native communities and to native storytellers and native stories for those kinds of stories and to see us in that kind of a way.
Well, with Native stories, and then you mentioned your mother, and I am a mother, and what I was so enormously struck by is her courageous love, as you say. She's also Harvard educated. You have a father who was Native who abandoned the family. Your mother could have easily made another choice. She could have just kept you on her side of the fence of family and friends, but instead, it seemed as if she made this admission that you understood the legacy you carry with your own ancestral clan and with the book she presented to you and the life she made possible, and that she would take you to Canaan Lake, which was the repository of this enormous family. And I felt like your mother was so responsible for knitting the bonds of that family and then entering a relationship with yet another Native man who became like a second father. So tell us a little bit, because that's such a dichotomy, and I think many other mothers might have made a different choice.
Yeah, my mom, perhaps interestingly, perhaps ironically, depending on how you look at it, is a big reason why I remained connected to my culture, despite the fact that my father left when I was a young boy. He, was struggling with alcoholism, with his own trauma from his own birth and upbringing in Cannon Lake, which was, as sort of hinted at, pretty troubling. And it was also sort of chasing this sort of native art world fame. I know that native and fame are like usually kind of contradiction in terms, but like, my dad, when I was a little kid, was pictured on the cover of Native People's magazine, like to the extent that there was such a thing as a famous Indian artist, like my dad was kind of it. And, he left, and like obviously I look the way I look. They also stuck about as Indian a name on me as you could possibly stick on a kid. Like nobody read Julian Brave NoiseCat at school attendance and was like, well, what's your ethnic background, And, there I was with, a white mom, and I should also say like a Irish-Jewish mom. And so, like my mom needs to put on a lot of sunscreen when she goes out into the sun. And I think she had this, I don't think it was necessarily fully thought through, but I think that she had this instinct that if she did not keep me connected to my father's family and to my culture, that I would have a lot of complicated feelings and questions as I got older. So, she did these really thoughtful things. Like she brought me down to the Intertribal Friendship House in Oakland, California, which is where I grew up. It's the third oldest urban Indian community center in the country, and there's a whole set of very interesting stories connected there. She would bring me back to Cannon Lake, which is the res that my family comes from, most Christmases and summers. And Oakland, California to Cannon Lake, British Columbia is pretty far. It's about 24 hours by car. It's over 1,000 miles in a country away. And one of the most beautiful things about that is that my father's family, Native people I have found have a very expansive understanding of family relationships. And so they welcomed her in, and to this day, call her sister, call her Auntie Alex. And even just this past summer, my partner Joan and I were visiting Cannon Lake for my late cousin brother's Memorial Fast Pitch Softball Tournament, very Canadian sport. They don't really play that one in America. And my cousins and aunts and uncles were all like, oh, where's Sister Alex? Where's like Auntie Alex? And I was like, well, I'm actually related to you. Like, am I not good enough? And I think that exposed me to, I think I'm emphasizing here the beauty of Native family and relationships and culture and all that. And obviously that's something that is a huge part of who I am and I'm incredibly proud of. It's also worth saying that there's complexity there. So you brought up, after my father, my mom was involved with another Native man who I write about in the book. His name was Coco. He was essentially like a second father figure to me. When I didn't have a dad to play catch with, which, in American culture, like learning how to play baseball, at least in my day, was like kind of fundamental to the father-son thing. And, he taught me how to throw like a two-seam fastball. And when all these other kids had their father to play catch with, I had Coco, and like he helped me get good at baseball. And he also taught me how to dance powwow, which is, to this day, a huge part of who I am. He was a White Mountain Apache man. He spoke his language fluently, and he was deeply knowledgeable, not just about the Apache culture, but about Native cultures across North America. There's a record label called Canyon Records that publishes a lot of the sort of Native music in the US, and they used to send him the records to like review them before they would distribute them more widely. Like he was like, to the extent that there's like a Native cultural intellectual, he was kind of that. And, he also had his own complicated history of, he had a record, he had a record of violence towards women, and at a certain point that came into our family home and context. And so, I had this real sense, from my own father to Coco to my grandfather and all these other sort of figures in my extended family and life, that, there was this really beautiful part of being Native, and that there was also, these lingering traumas from colonization, and, these more complicated aspects of it that, especially as I got older and, became a man, I myself had to grapple with. And the book has a lot to do with that.
Well, there is pain on the page, and I that is what is transmitted also, because you write a very honest look at life and your story against a larger one, but you do write about being this heartsick boy, missing your dad. You called it a dad sickness, a hollow of sadness that carved out your eyes, your smile. It was like my spirit had left my body, and it was such a grieving for this father. And there are so many threads to catch in We Survived the Night, and the singular and really most important one here is that of your relationship with your father. And it's like the real heart of the story, and the Odyssey began, and there was this pivot point in which it kind of turned your life to understanding there's a larger story to tell here. Do you remember about that pivot point in which you thought, I can do this?
I'm actually not sure what you're referring to, but I'm also staring at my own son, and so I'm a little, I'm a little caught up in the extended story and legacy of it all.
It's so beautiful to look out and see the beginnings of another story. Well, importantly, I'll say this. Importantly, then, you always bring forgiveness. You bring forgiveness to this story.
Yeah, so I would say two things. I would say, firstly, that the discovery of the 215 potential unmarked graves at the Kamloops Indian Residential School, which was a moment of international reckoning on this history, was a moment of reckoning in so many Native families that were connected to these schools in Canada as well as the United States, including my own. And in the wake of that, I, of course, decided to set out to make the documentary Sugarcane with my colleague from my days as a journalist, Emily Cassie. I also really set out writing this book. I'd actually gotten the contract to write the book a little bit before that, but of course that event really transformed the way I was thinking about writing this book. And then I decided to do something potentially, unusual for, at the time, a 28-year-old bachelor who'd been living for the last decade of his life on the East Coast. And that was, I decided to move back in with my old man, who I hadn't lived with since I was about 6, 7 years old. Not to contribute to the meme that all your kids are probably doing this whole year. But, I decided to move in with him. And so suddenly, after not living together for 22 years, we were sleeping across the hallway from each other, cooking each other breakfast, hanging out late into the night. I wrote about this in the New York Times and in the book. My dad is no longer an alcoholic. He's exchanged the drink for, he's a pothead. And so, we would stay up late, and he's kind of like my pusher man. And I quit drinking 6 years ago myself, but I'm what they call California sober or BC sober, depending on your national affiliation. And so, I'd stay up late into the night with him as he'd force me to take hit after hit of the bong. And I turned my tape recorder on, and I just listened to his life stories, and I ended up learning a lot more about him and what he'd been through, and he learned a lot more about me, and we got a lot closer. And while I was doing all that, the second part of this that I think is really, to me, intriguing and sort of gestures at something else that I'm interested in my work, which is not just culture, but also, spirituality and the way that some certain things seem to transcend across time and generation. I started to look more into my own people's oral histories, because I had this inkling of an idea, that if I was working on this documentary that was essentially about the system, the educational assimilation system that was trying to stamp out my people's culture and way of life, then in the book that I was writing, I had a responsibility to try to bring that culture and way of life, back to life to the extent that I could on the page. And so, I was doing all this research on these oral histories that, I had never heard members of my own family tell, except for maybe once. And to learn about them, I was literally on the American Museum of Natural History's website, learning about myself, that's a picture of being Native in the 21st century, an Indian kid, researching themselves on the internet. And, you know, in the PDF, I was reading about our first ancestor, this character who's very common across North American indigenous oral history, the figure of the trickster coyote. He's perhaps by geography, most known trickster of all tricksters to humankind. They tell stories about the trickster coyote all the way from Western Canada to like Costa Rica, which is an astonishingly large geography. And
can I just add this one? Because this is a connective tissue.
Yeah.
That is really, it's a parable. It's like a parable and an epic story of the coyote that a lot of us just don't have any sense. Many of us don't have a sense of ancestry. It's complex.
Yeah.
You describe him as conveying a worldview where the complexity of humanity, nature, and life is celebrated, cursed, laughed at, and grappled with, all at the same time. Transformational character.
Exactly, and part of what's interesting about the trickster coyote, and this became very clear as I was reading the stories about him that were collected from my people, is that he is a really contradictory figure. On the one hand, he's kind of second only to the creator in the account of creation, which is to say that he's like, this mythic ancestor. On the other hand, in every story about the coyote, he's like our example to our children of how they're not supposed to act. He's constantly tricking people and getting tricked, trying to steal stuff and getting his stuff stolen. And he's also notably kind of a deadbeat dad. So he has all these kids, which are us, and then he kind of abandons them. So he's a womanizer and absentee father. And so I was reading about, you gotta like imagine, right? Like my dad is out in the carving studio, jamming out to Led Zeppelin, like taking rips from the bong. And I'm sitting there trying to figure out how to write this book and trying to bring my, people's culture that has been nearly killed off by this intense history of assimilation and colonization back to life on the page. And I'm reading in the PDF about this creator, destroyer, trickster, deadbeat dad. And I'm looking out at the carving studio at my own, creator, destroyer, trickster, deadbeat dad father. And I'm looking back at the PDF and out at the carving studio. And, it hits me like, oh my gosh, or I should say, oh my creator, my father is the trickster coyote. And that insight, that these stories, among many other things, were getting at these truths about the patriarchs in our families, about human nature, even more broadly than that, made me ask a question that I'd never seen asked of narrative nonfiction before, and I've read quite a bit of it, which is, what would it be to take the coyote story specifically, but our oral histories, which our own people always regarded as nonfiction, seriously as nonfiction. And so a major thread in the book, and a way that I conceptualize my father and the story of Indian country more broadly than that, is actually through the epic misadventures of our ancestor, the trickster coyote.
And that is the connective tissue, and it's the thread you pull through the whole thing. And again, it lends itself to your forgiving tone with things, and I kind of got a real kick out of even how you looked at your grandfather who fathered 13?
No, more than that.
No, how many children?
19 children.
19 children.
He played a disproportionate role in helping bring our people back from a genocide.
See? That, to my point exactly, that he can look at this grandfather with many different women and producing 19 children and say, yes, but look, our culture and our people are coming back, and he was a direct contributor. And the other thing that for me, and we were saying this to you last night, my two sisters are here, but both our parents were only children, we had no cousins, we had no aunts and uncles, we really did not have a sense of a big family other than our own. This dive into this very vibrant, and again, for everyone who reads this book and watches Sugarcane, it's a very vibrant, living community that is literally, here we are, another generation coming up, bringing a history to life that is a gift to all of our history. But that thread of family, now that is something that seems extraordinary, because that is very deliberately nurtured and very deliberately grown in that wide network. So what does family mean if you are a Native person?
Yeah, I mean, I think that part of the crisis that we're living through in, liberal Western society is, in my view, one of alienation. Over the last, in particular, 60, 70 years, since the sort of post-war moment, we have been doing this immense human experiment of, living as individuals largely, very distant in many instances from our extended family. For the vast majority of human history, that was not how our species lived. And part of what I think is interesting about Native life, and I think, is part of our resilience, is that we remain, despite, as I mentioned, over a century of trying to tear apart Native culture and Native families specifically. I mean, that was the intention of the Indian residential schools in Canada and the Native American boarding schools here in the United States. We have retained, to a very great degree, our emphasis on the importance of familial connection, on the significance of what it means to be related to one another. And, if you come from families where your grandfather had 19 children, which is not exactly a straightforwardly good or bad thing, I think part of what the trickster story and the sort of conception of these complicated patriarchal figures, and complicated figures in general, tells you is that, you need to be able to not just forgive, but also to love complicated people, right? Like, if you come from families like ours, where you have hundreds of cousins, where you have many aunts and uncles, where your grandfather had that many kids, and that meant that he maybe wasn't the greatest partner to your grandmother, who herself had a complicated relationship with your father, that you have to be able to embrace these sort of contradictory, complicated figures all the way back to your first ancestor, the trickster coyote. That is one of, if you're going to live in a society, in a culture that's premised on familial connection, you got to be able to deal with the stuff that we all know exists in our family, which is complicated dads, complicated siblings, complicated mothers, fathers, cousins, all of that stuff.
And watch Sugar Cane, because there was a scene in Sugar Cane that stopped our hearts. And again, it's this constant theme of forgiveness and love, and a love that overcomes things that are hard, things that are painful. And you have the scene where you and your father, and we do not see your grandmother, we do not see her, but we hear her cry. And then what you all say, we survived the night, we survived the night. I had these little props. I had these mugs made for you.
Oh, cool.
We survived the night, because explain the significance of we survived the night.
Wow, I love that. So throughout the book, I'm working with my own people's language and culture, all the way up from the level of and I'm going to use a linguistics term here, the level of the morpheme, all the way up to the level of the structure of the book. And at the level of language, my people's language has nearly been killed off by schools like St. Joseph's Mission. My grandmother is one of only 2 remaining fluent speakers on the Cannon Lake Indian Reserve. It's her and her sister, and they're both in their 80s. And I'm very fortunate that I learned a great deal of that language from her. And when I would sit down, when I was at college with her, I lived on the res during the summers, I'd sit down with her to learn Secwepemc Muxin, which is our language. And she would, when we sat down, always go to the cabinet and grab a mug that said Chochwinuk on it, which is the traditional way. I learned that this was the traditional way to give the morning greeting in Secwepemc Muxin. And what's interesting about Chochwinuk is it doesn't literally mean good morning. It actually means you survived the night. And after learning that, I thought, what a intense thing to say to each other. And what did that mean in 1863 when 2/3 of our nation died of smallpox? What did that mean in the mornings after the children were taken away to the Indian residential schools? And also, what kind of twisted, gallows sense of humor decided to put "you survived the night" on the coffee mug of a grandmother who was taken away to one of those schools? And if you ever watch Sugar Cane, here's a little sort of Easter egg that only people who understand our language ever usually get, how witty it is. In that scene where we're walking into that same house where my cat still lives, for my father to have this conversation that he's needed to have with his mother about his birth for his entire life, I walk in the door and the first thing I say is, you survived the night, Grandma, and remember that thing I said about they should have a native Seinfeld? Not missing a beat, she goes, oh, don't remind me.
It's really powerful. So I think everyone should try to watch this, read his books. But listen, we have a few minutes for some questions. Does anyone? Yes. I think we have mics that can come around.
I just want to thank you so much for this book. It's so unique. It is so powerful, and it's really important. I hope everybody gets a chance to read it. So thank you. And I read We Survived the Night, and I also listened to it. And I'm glad I listened to it for two reasons. First, I enjoyed hearing the accurate pronunciation of words that I would see that had a 7 and an apostrophe and 7 vowels or a lot of consonants, so I appreciated that. And it also, as you know, you're the narrator, it's your story, and I'm really glad that your voice was the narrator, so I thank you for that. That was really powerful. You're embodying the storyteller of your people, as you know. But for me, I just wanted to say, for me, We Survived the Night was enlightening. It was really unique. It was tender. It was brilliant. And it brought me to tears with things that I could identify with, and with other things that I just couldn't fathom, but I could only feel. And I really appreciate that. Thank you. So my question to you, finally, is how did writing this book impact you? Deep, deep, deep down.
Wow. Well, firstly, thank you so much. That was incredibly generous. How did it not impact me? I guess I'll start with the familial. And part of what was really beautiful about getting to write this book, as well as making Sugarcane at the same time, is that it called me to be with my family and with my people at a time where I really needed to be. I had lived life on the East Coast before that. I had been sort of a white-collar professional who'd gone to the fancy schools and all that sort of a thing. And I would say that telling these stories, part of what I think is really distinct about nonfiction as compared to fiction, and fiction has, from a narrative perspective, some things up on nonfiction, right? You get to write it in whatever way is the most literary. You can write your characters in ways that you are harder to do in nonfiction. But one thing that I think is special about nonfiction is that it's in part about how you choose to, live your life and observe your story in relation to your own life. And if you are coming from the perspective of people whose way of life was very nearly, killed off, that specific calling of the nonfiction storyteller is actually a kind of profound thing. And what I would say is that, at the most basic level, writing this book called me to live a more indigenous way of life, true to the culture, the language, and also the familial relationships of my people. And that helped me repair, my relationship with my dad, for example. Living together for 2 years, we became best buds. He actually read the book and watched the documentary. He did lose the first copy of the book that I gave him, which felt very true to form. And then after I gave him a second copy and he read it, he told me for the first time in his life that he understood a bit more about what he'd put me through, and he actually apologized to me, which is the first time he ever did that. And so, I think that is a really beautiful, meaningful thing. And now that I'm becoming a father myself, actually at the same age that my father became a father, I think that all this stuff that I've written about, being on the son side of these stories, is deeply shaping how I'm thinking about and going about, with my partner, being a father now to a kid who, is 3 generations removed from the Indian residential schools, 2 generations removed from the Indian day schools, and for whom, there's going to be now more culture and access to language and all these sorts of things that, I had to really go out and seek, than there has been perhaps in, Joan and I were talking about this, maybe a century for our families, which is a really profound thing. And I think that telling stories and writing this book was really central to pointing my entire life in that direction.
As a child growing up in New York, my grandmother and mother were always getting envelopes from the Indian missions. And they would always, neither of them had a lot of money, but they would always give whatever they could, stuff envelopes, stuff dollars in the envelope. I assumed, they told me, when I asked them, I said, are these orphans? And they said, I think they told me that they were. They had no parents. And that Father so-and-so was always a religious head of this, needed our contributions to raise these children. Could you set me straight about that? Thank you.
Yeah, so if you watch Sugarcane, there's an example of an ad that actually used to run on Canadian television for Adopt Indian and Métis, AIM, which is super ironic because the most significant Native political organization ever was also called the American Indian Movement, the same initials. And the basic story here is that these networks that were developed to adopt Native children out of their contexts were, as we sort of investigate in Sugarcane, often connected to the schools themselves. So the Catholic Church had one called the Catholic Aid Society, and it was part of this broader story of adopting or trying to separate Native children from their familial and cultural contexts as part of the broader project of colonization, which it's worth saying actually still continues with the foster system. There's actually now more children in care, Native children in care, than there were during the height of the Indian residential and Native American boarding schools. So to a certain extent, this story is still continuing. And there are numerous studies about, the value of keeping Native children connected to their family, their culture. And so, there are definitely Native children and children in general, of course, who are born into circumstances where their parents maybe are not in the best position to provide as parents. And I would point towards a history of purposefully denying Native families the right to raise their own children as being the main culprit in that, right? If you deprive an entire race of people the right to parent their own children, that right for over a century, eventually they unlearn how to do it. Like at a certain point, I can't really hold it against my own father that he didn't know how to be a dad to me or my little sister because, his parents didn't know how to parent and they were taken away to the schools and so their parents didn't get to parent them. And you have to go back like 4 or 5 generations before you find, Native children actually being raised by their own parents past the age of 5 or 6.
It's generational trauma. That's what his book makes so clear. And these institutions tried to erase the indigenous culture and people.
And so what I would say is that, that was part of, the adopting out of children was part of this broader sort of system that was designed to assimilate Native children by taking away from their parents and their cultures. And that, that has perpetrated a great deal of harm, and was also premised on something that the entire book is trying to refute, which is this idea that Native culture was backwards, right? The entire story of colonization, to a large extent, was premised on the idea that Native culture had nothing to offer the world, that it needed to die off, and that when it died off, that would be progress. And I think when you consider an oral tradition as vast as the Coyote stories, for example, which, as I write about in the book, contain memories of environmental transformations that go back 11,000 years in certain instances, which is worth mentioning, a great deal older than the pyramids, a great deal older than the Bible, and that also gets at so many complicated and literary and philosophical things about, families, about the world, about our land, about tradition, all these different things. I think it undermines the entire notion that getting rid of those things was progress. Perhaps these traditions that were passed orally for thousands of years actually have something of value to lend to a broader humanity. And I think that, that sort of thing is rarely, if ever, looked at. I went to a university where we had to study the great books of Western civilization, as part of our core curriculum. Would it have been so, difficult to read like one version of Coyote Steals the Salmon as part of that, that course? No, but also was that a question that, any of the deans or professors or any of the people who taught, and determined the curriculum ever asked? Also no.
So Julian, we are unfortunately out of time, but you have really brought us into this fold of the incredibly rich and complex story of North America's first people. It's a history that does belong to all of us. It's a history that we all bear responsibility for. Your book is a treasure. It should be in every library. And we are so grateful that you honored us with your visit today. Thank you so much.